June 27, 1944. Saint-Lô, Normandy. The air smelled of wet earth and cordite. In a camouflaged command post buried beneath the shattered remains of a Norman farmhouse, Oberst Hans von Luck pressed his fingers against his temples and studied the map before him. Red circles marked American positions. Blue arrows showed German defensive lines. But it was the annotations in the margins that told the true story numbers that defied belief. Artillery pieces per kilometer, shells expended per hour, tonnage delivered per square mile. Von Luck had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had witnessed the mechanized fury of modern war from the steppes to the Atlantic. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was unfolding in the hedgerows of Normandy. The distant thunder rolled across the Bocage country like a storm that never broke, never moved, never ceased. American artillery, not the sharp crack of individual guns firing in sequence, but something else entirely, a continuous roar that obliterated the boundary between one explosion and the next. Von Luck closed his eyes, even here, 3 kilometers behind the front. The ground trembled with a rhythm that had no pause, no mercy, no end. For German staff officers trained in the meticulous doctrines of the Reichswehr and Wehrmacht, artillery had always been a science of precision and economy. Final missions were calculated endeavors. Guns were concentrated at decisive points, unleashed in carefully timed barrages, then displaced before counter-battery fire could respond. Resources were finite. Every shell was accounted for. Every barrage served a tactical purpose within a larger operational design. This was the artillery of Sedan, of Smolensk, of 100 victorious campaigns. It was the artillery of calculation. What the Americans brought to Normandy was something fundamentally different. It was the artillery of abundance. The German army had entered the Normandy campaign confident in its defensive prowess. The Atlantic Wall, however incomplete, represented the most extensive fortification system ever constructed. Behind it lay veteran divisions hardened by years of combat, supported by the finest tactical doctrine in the world. German officers knew the terrain favored defense. The hedgerows of the Bocage were natural fortifications, each field a potential killing ground. They expected a grinding attritional struggle. They expected to bleed the Anglo-American armies white against positions prepared through months of labor. They expected, alternately, to hold. They did not expect to be buried alive under a weight of steel that turned earth itself into a weapon. The numbers began to filter back through intelligence summaries and after-action reports in early July. At first, German staff officers questioned their accuracy. Surely there had been errors in translation, mistakes in estimation, exaggeration born of shock and stress. But as reports accumulated from multiple sectors, from different divisions, from observers whose credibility could not be doubted, a terrible picture emerged. The Americans were deploying artillery at densities the German army had never achieved, never imagined, and could no longer counter. In the sector west of Saint-Lô, U.S. First Army had concentrated over 300 artillery pieces along a front of approximately 15 kilometers. This yielded a density of 20 guns per kilometer, a ratio that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had employed even during the great offensives of 1940 and 1941. But density alone told only part of the story. What stunned German analysts was the sustained rate of fire these batteries maintained. During Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive launched on July 25. Supporting artillery units fired continuously for hours. Some battalions expended their entire basic load of ammunition, over 100 rounds per gun, within a single 24-hour period. The 29th Infantry Division's supporting artillery alone fired more than 30,000 rounds in the opening phase of the offensive. Across the entire First Army front, American guns hurled an estimated 140,000 shells into German positions in preparation for the breakout. In his command post near Percy, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, experienced the full weight of this bombardment. His division, one of the most powerful armored formations in the German army, had been inserted to block the American advance. On the morning of July 25, As Cobra commenced, Bayerlein's position disappeared beneath a storm of high explosive and white phosphorus. The bombardment combined with aerial bombing lasted for hours. When it finally lifted, Bayerlein emerged to find his division shattered. Over 70% of his combat personnel were casualties, tanks sat abandoned, their crews dead or incapacitated. Company command posts had ceased to exist, radio communications had dissolved into static and screams. The entire front was a landscape of craters, Bayerlein would later report. No man could have lived through it without losing his mind. What German officers found most psychologically devastating was not the intensity of individual barrages, but their constancy. American artillery did not mass, fire, and withdraw. It fired, and then kept firing. Forward observers called down shells on targets of opportunity, a machine gun position here, a suspected mortar emplacement there, a farmhouse that might contain infantry. The ammunition flowed endlessly from supply dumps that seemed inexhaustible. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of particular American guns, the flat crack of the 105 mm howitzer, the deeper boom of the 155 mm long tom, the freight train rumble of multiple shells in flight. But more than any individual weapon, they learned to fear the totality, system that could sustain fire not for minutes or hours, but for days. At 7th Army headquarters, staff officers attempted to calculate the logistical implication. A single American artillery battalion firing at standard rates required approximately 100 tons of ammunition per day. Multiply this across dozens of battalions, factor in the additional consumption during major offensives, and the numbers became staggering. The Americans were expending more artillery ammunition in Normandy each week than the entire German army had stockpiled in France at the start of the invasion. Where did it all come from? How was it transported? How could any industrial system produce such quantities? The answer lay not in France, but across an ocean, in the sprawling factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Gary, in the shipyards of the East Coast, in a continental-scale industrial apparatus that operated beyond the conceptual framework of European military planning. American factories were producing artillery shells at rates approaching 8 million rounds per month. These shells moved from factory to front through a logistical chain that stretched across the Atlantic, immune to interdiction, sustained by a merchant marine that replaced losses faster than U-boats could sink them. The German staff officers who studied these figures understood they were not facing merely an army, but an industrial civilization mobilized for war. In a capture document circulated among German staff officers in August 1944, an unnamed analyst attempted to contextualize what Normandy represented. The Americans have solved the problem of tactical firepower through industrial mass production, the report noted. They do not attempt to achieve surprise through operational art or tactical finesse. They announce their intentions openly. Mass overwhelming firepower, the chosen point, and advance through the wreckage. Our doctrine assumes a thinking enemy who must husband resources and employ them with skill. We face instead an enemy who has eliminated resource constraints from tactical calculation. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound and cumulative. Veterans who had fought across Russia spoke of Soviet artillery with respect. It was brutal, massive, often poorly directed, but survivable if one knew how to read terrain and time. American artillery was different. It was precise and abundant, scientific and relentless. Forward observers adjusted fire with uncanny accuracy. Shells arrived on target within minutes of being called. Counter-battery fire struck German guns almost immediately after they revealed themselves. Fire missions could be sustained indefinitely, adjusted in real time, concentrated or dispersed as tactical situations demanded. The symbolic object that came to represent this new reality was not a weapon, but something more prosaic, the American ammunition crate. German soldiers found them everywhere in the Norman countryside, stacked in vast pyramids beside artillery positions, piled in supply dumps that stretched to the horizon, discarded along roads after their contents had been expended. Each crate bore markings indicating origin, lot number, and specifications the bureaucratic fingerprint of an industrial system so productive that it could afford to mark even the containers of its excess. For German soldiers who had spent years fighting with chronic ammunition shortages, who had learned to count every shell and plan every fire mission around scarcity, these crates represented something alien and demoralizing. They were not merely logistical objects, but symbols of a disparity that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. By early August, as American forces broke out into Brittany and wheeled east toward the scene, German staff assessments had evolved from shock to grim recognition. In a report dated August 7, 1944, the operations officer of LXXX Fort Corps wrote, "The American artillery superiority is not merely quantitative, but represents a fundamental difference in military philosophy. They have subordinated tactical art to industrial capacity. They accept casualties that we would consider prohibitive, because they can afford to trade losses for territorial gain. Most critically, they have eliminated the resource calculations that constrain our operational planning. When we mass artillery, we expose ourselves to counter-battery fire, and logistics become a limiting factor. The Americans mass artillery and sustain the bombardment until nothing remains of our positions. This is not a tactical problem. It is a systemic one that cannot be solved at the divisional or corps level. The transformation in German military thinking occurred not through any single revelation, but through accumulation, reports piling upon reports, experiences reinforcing experiences, until the truth became inescapable. The Wehrmacht's tactical excellence, its operational flexibility, its soldiers' skill and determination, none of these could compensate for the material imbalance that Normandy revealed. German officers had entered the campaign believing that quality could trump quantity, that superior doctrine could offset industrial disparity. Normandy taught them otherwise. What haunted the German staff officers more than the defeats themselves was what those defeats implied about the broader trajectory of the war. If the Americans could deploy such overwhelming firepower in Normandy, what would they bring to the Siegfried Line, to the Rhine, to the heart of Germany itself? The arithmetic was inescapable and apocalyptic. Every month that passed increased the disparity. Every German shell expended was one that could not be replaced. Every American shell fired was followed by 10 more, 100 more, 1,000 more. In the wreckage of Saint-Lô, in the shattered hedgerows around Coutances, in the smoldering ruin of Falaise, German soldiers learned a lesson that no amount of training or ideology could unlearn. They learned what it meant to face an enemy for whom abundance was doctrine, for whom firepower was unlimited, for whom victory was not a matter of skill or will but of industrial capacity applied without restraint or mercy. September 1944. Somewhere in the German rear areas, the staff officers who had survived Normandy gathered in requisitioned buildings and temporary headquarters, compiling their observations, writing their reports, attempting to distill lessons from catastrophe. Their analyses were meticulous, professional, and profoundly pessimistic. They had witnessed the future of war, and it belonged to nations that could turn entire economies into weapon systems. The age of tactical art was ending. The age of industrial warfare had arrived in its full maturity. In the margin of one captured German document, an unknown officer had written a single sentence, underlined twice: "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory that produces soldiers and shells faster than we can destroy them." This was the conclusion that German staff officers drew from Normandy. Not merely that they had lost a battle, but that they were fighting a form of war for which their doctrine had no answer. American artillery density represented not a tactical innovation, but a philosophical divergence. It was the embodiment of democratic industrial capitalism applied to the problem of warfare, mass production, logistical sophistication, and a willingness to expend material wealth to preserve human ideology. The thunder of American guns echoed long after Normandy had fallen silent. It rolled across the Rhine, reverberated through the Ruhr, and finally crashed against Berlin itself. For German staff officers trained to see war as an art, Normandy was the moment they realized they faced an opponent who had transformed it into an industry, one that could not be defeated by skill alone, only by a productive capacity they no longer possessed and could never regain. In the end, The conclusion was inescapable. They had calculated wrong. Not in tactics or terrain, not in deployment or defensive doctrine, but in understanding what they faced. The Americans had brought to France not merely an army, but the industrial might of a continent unchained. And against such abundance, even excellence was not enough.